Hello everyone, Mr. Linder here. Let's talk about how the immune system combats viruses. So when viruses invade the body, they're going to encounter innate defenses and specific defenses, just as bacteria do. The difference with viruses is viruses oftentimes hide within body cells, so they actually infect host cells. And so, in order to fight viruses, we have to be able to produce antibodies through antibody mediated immunity, but we also have to be able to activate what's called cell mediated immunity, in which white blood cells can attack infected host cells. So, in order to understand an immune response diagram like this one, we first have to look at how white blood cells actually interact with each other. So before we can really talk about antibody-mediated immunity, or how we can talk about cell-mediated immunity, we need to look at the interactions between white blood cells and then come back to this diagram to see how the virus that has invaded the host actually gets neutralized. So cell-mediated immunity involves T lymphocytes, and to a lesser extent, it involves natural killer cells. And in order for T lymphocytes to recognize infected host cells, there has to be some interaction between the cytotoxic T cell, or what we call the killer T cell, and the host cell or the target cell. So in order for those cells to interact with each other, there has to be specific proteins that can bind to each other so that the cells can actually recognize what type of cell it is and whether that cell is actually infected with a virus. Because we wouldn't want killer T cells going around and destroying body cells that aren't infected by a pathogen. So how does a cytotoxic T cell or a killer T cell actually recognize infected body cells? Well, it's going to use its T cell receptor. So this is the T cell receptor, and it's going to use what's called a CD8 protein to interact with a specific protein that's found on body cells, which is the class 1 major histocompatibility complex. And this particular class 1 MHC is showing a viral antigen. So that means that this particular host cell actually has virus in it, and that viral fragment is being presented to the body's immune system. So cytotoxic T cells can actually bind to cells in the body that are displaying foreign antigenic fragments. And if it's displaying an antigenic fragment on a class 1 MHC, then that cytotoxic T cell can recognize that that is an infected body cell. So T lymphocytes have to be able to use their T cell receptors in order to bind with the major histocompatibility complexes. It turns out that all nucleated body cells have MHC proteins. However, there are different types of MHC proteins. So if we were to look at different cells within the body, we'll notice that there are different classifications for the major histocompatibility complexes. MHC class 1s are located on all nucleated human cells. So when viruses invade a cell, they can actually be digested, and their antigenic fragments can actually be loaded onto the class 1 MHC, and that's what can be presented to the cytotoxic T cells, or what we call killer T cells. Sometimes they're also just referred to as CD8 cells. So cytotoxic T cells are able to use their T cell receptor. Cytotoxic T cells can use their T cell receptor and their CD8 co-receptor to bind with the class 1 MHC that is presenting the antigenic fragment. So there's an interaction between the two cells. The other classification is the class 2 MHCs. They're located primarily on antigen-presenting cells. They're also found on B lymphocytes and even other types of macrophages and dendritic type cells. Essentially anything that can present antigen to a helper T cell. So immune system cells oftentimes engulf the viral antigens. They are digested and then presented to the helper T cells. Helper T cells are oftentimes called the CD4 cells because they use a CD4 co-receptor. So they also have a T cell receptor and a CD4 protein that can be used to locate that foreign antigen when it's presented on a class 2 MHC. So there's different varieties of major histocompatibility complexes depending upon what type of cell is being activated within the immune response. Helper T cells are going to be involved in both antibody-mediated immunity and cell-mediated immunity. Cytotoxic T cells are just involved in the cell-mediated immunity response. So cytotoxic T cells can basically go and destroy virally infected body cells when they are presenting antigenic fragments on the class 1 MHC. So to kind of summarize what we're talking about here we have an example where a virus-infected cell, so this macrophage has taken in the virus, it's actually presenting on a class 2 MHC so that helper T cells can be activated. And helper T cells can actually go on to activate B cells, and B cells are going to be involved in antibody production, or helper T cells can go on and activate cytotoxic T cells or killer T cells. We also, though, can see that infected body cells can present on class 1 MHCs directly to your cytotoxic T cells, your killer T cells, and that will lead to the destruction of infected body cells that have this viral pathogen. So how do cytotoxic T cells go about destroying infected body cells? What cytotoxic T cells do is they release perforin and also chemicals called granzymes. Granzymes are essentially proteases that can be used to digest infected cells. And perforins can actually create holes in the infected cells so that the target cell will lyse. Cytotoxic T cells can also release death ligands that can lead to the apoptosis of the infected cells. So there are a variety of ways for cytotoxic T cells to destroy infected body cells. Now, helper T cells do not directly attack pathogens, and they don't directly attack infected body cells, but as I mentioned before, they're capable of activating both pathways. So in this particular diagram, we can see that an antigen-presenting cell is presenting to the helper T cell using the class 2 MHC. And the helper T cell, by utilizing interleukins, chemical signals that communicate with white blood cells, can activate both the killer T cells, the cytotoxic T cells, or can activate the B cell lineages. B cells are going to lead to the production of antibodies, and those antibodies can be used to neutralize the virus. Or the helper T cells can activate the cell-mediated pathway, where cytotoxic T cells can use their perforins and their granzymes and their apoptosis capabilities to attack the infected body cells and thus destroy the body cell, and that leads to the destruction of the virus as well. So helper T cells can perform these tasks when they bind to the class 2 MHCs and they use their CD4 protein and their T cell receptor, as long as there is foreign antigen that is being presented to the T helper cells. And so the T helper cells can go on to, again, activate the B cells that produce antibodies, or it can go on to activate the cytotoxic T cells, and those pathways are going to neutralize virus. T helper cells can also release something called interferon. Interferon is a chemical signal that can activate macrophages, and that can actually prepare other body cells as well for viral invasion. So oftentimes interferon is a way to prep the body cells to protect them against viral invasion in the first place. T helper cells also release a lot of interleukins to communicate with the various lymphocytes, and they also produce colony stimulating factors, which is going to enhance leukocytosis or leukocyte production. So to summarize everything that's going on, we can now go back to the summary diagram and now better understand what's happening in the antibody-mediated immunity pathway and the cell-mediated immunity pathway. So when a virus invades a host, there are several things that are taking place. The first thing to take a look at is, do we already have antibodies that are pre-existing within the body? If there are pre-existing antibodies, then those antibodies can already attack the virus. Pre-existing antibodies are going to coat the virus. They're going to act as opsonization factors, things that can bind to something foreign to the body and then enhance phagocytosis. But those pre-existing antibodies are only going to be there if this is a virus that the immune system has already seen, so a virus that has already been in the body. If this is a new virus, a novel virus, then there aren't going to be pre-existing antibodies. And so there's going to have to be a pathway for the production of antibodies. So antibodies that previously exist are coming from memory cells because the virus has been in the body before. But if this is a new virus, then we're going to have to go through an activation pathway. So what would that activation pathway look like? Well, macrophages are going to ingest the virus, and they're going to be presenting to the helper T cells. So they're going to be using their MHC class 2s. So macrophages engulf the virus, and they then present to helper T cells using the class 2 MHCs. So we have the class 2 MHC, we have the T cell receptor, and then of course you're going to have the viral fragment in between so that the helper T cells can become activated. Once the helper T cells are activated, they can go on to activate B lymphocytes. B lymphocytes can become plasma cells, and those plasma cells can now secrete specific antibodies to go back and combat the virus that has invaded the body. We also see that there are going to be cytokine chemicals released from macrophages that are going to trigger the inflammatory response, so a non-specific response to viruses. And we're also going to see the release of interferon, and that interferon can help in activating the antiviral proteins to limit the infection by the virus into body cells. So interferon can act as a way to prevent the virus from getting into body cells in the first place. The other mechanism to take a look at is actually activating the cytotoxic T cells. So in order to activate cytotoxic T cells, we oftentimes use T helper cells. So T helper cells are going to activate cytotoxic T cells, and they're going to allow for cytotoxic T cells to go and attack those virally infected body cells. But another thing that we can do is directly activate the cytotoxic T cells. So when viruses invade body cells, so when we have an infected host cell, cytotoxic T cells can come along and become activated when they recognize viral fragments on a class 1 MHC. So newly activated cytotoxic T cells from the virus-infected host cell can then go and attack the virally infected body cells, use their perforins and gramzymes and apoptosis capabilities to destroy the infected body cells. So we actually have a couple pathways for cytotoxic T cells. They can either directly use MHC class 1s to become activated, or they can be activated by helper T cells so that we can destroy virally infected body cells. So we basically have two pathways to fight against the viruses that invade the body. We can use antibodies through antibody-mediated immunity, or we can use the cytotoxic T cells in order to fight against virally infected body cells. Another summary diagram that is useful is to look at something like this, where antigen invades the body, and in this case we're talking about viruses. Viruses are going to be slowed down by innate defenses, so the defense mechanisms like inflammation that are non-specific but are meant to protect the body from antigenic pathogenic organisms. And then we can look at the adaptive defenses. So specifically, we can look at cell-mediated immunity. This would be cell-mediated in the beige box. Or we can look at antibody-mediated, which is going to be in the green box. So if a virus is in the body and we're looking at antibody-mediated, then we're going to have the activation of T helper cells, and the T helper cells are going to activate the B cells. The B cells are going to become plasma cells to produce antibodies, and the antibodies can be used to combat the viral antigen. Or we can look at how antigen-presenting cells activate T helper cells, or we can look at how the cytotoxic T cells are directly activated because the infected body cells are already presenting fragments on the MHC class 1. So we can have MHC class 1 direct activation of cytotoxic T cells, or we have the MHC class 2, which is the activation through T helper cells to thus activate cytotoxic T cells and even natural killer cells to utilize those cells to neutralize the virus that has gotten into infected body cells. So there's several different summary diagrams that you can use to summarize how viruses are combated using the immune system. So that's a little bit on fighting against viruses using antibody-mediated immunity and cell-mediated immunity. I hope that helps. Take care.